Welcome dear friends to my video lecture on Unit 10, that is Inclusive Education. This is the second video on Evolution of the Philosophy of Inclusive Education, Special, Integrated and Inclusive Education. What are the differences between special, integrated and inclusive education? So how this philosophy of inclusive education has evolved from the beginning, that we are going to talk about in this lecture. Let us straight away enter into the topic. The philosophy of inclusive education has evolved over time. It reflects a changing attitudes towards people with disabilities and diverse learning needs. This evolution is marked by three main stages: special education, integrated education and inclusive education. Each stage represents a shift in how society views and supports learners. What is special education? Special education was the earliest approach to educating children with disabilities. It began in the 19th century when schools for the blind, deaf and intellectually disabled were established. These schools aimed to provide specialized instruction. Teachers in special schools used methods tailored to the needs of specific disabilities. Special education created opportunities for children with disabilities to access learning. However, it often segregated them from their peers. These students were educated in separate schools or classrooms. The focus was on their limitations rather than their potential. This approach reinforced the idea that children with disabilities were different from others. So, they were separated from the normal children. It isolated them from mainstream education. While special education improved access, it did not promote equality or social inclusion. What is then integrated education? In the mid-20th century, attitude towards education disability began to change. The civil rights movement and human rights awareness played a key role. Society started to recognize the right of all children to education. This led to the idea of integrated education. Integrated education aimed to place children with disabilities in regular schools. It focused on including them in mainstream classrooms. However, the support provided was often inadequate. Teachers were not always trained to handle diverse learning needs. They were focusing on the needs of the normal children only. Even the curriculum was so specific to the normal children, not for the integrated children. In integrated education, children with disabilities were expected to adapt to the regular system. There were limited changes in teaching methods or school infrastructure. This made it difficult for many students to thrive. While integration was a step forward, it was not fully inclusive. Now, what is inclusive education? Inclusive education emerged in the late 20th century. It is based on the principle that all children have equal value. It recognizes diversity as a strength rather than a problem. Inclusive education focuses on transforming the education system to meet the needs of all learners. Inclusive education aims to provide quality education for every child in the same classroom. It seeks to eliminate barriers that prevent participation. Teachers use flexible teaching methods to address individual differences. Schools in inclusive systems are designed to be accessible for everyone. They ensure that children with disabilities, linguistic minorities, and marginalized groups feel welcome. Collaboration between teachers, parents, and communities is key here. The inclusive approach promotes the idea of education for all. It emphasizes equality, respect, and belonging. Inclusive education benefits all children by teaching them empathy and cooperation. What are the key factors driving inclusive education? Legislation, it's one of the key factors driving inclusive education. Laws such as the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities support inclusive education, so legislation. Then advocacy, propaganda. Disability rights movements and NGOs have raised awareness about inclusion. Then research, studies show that inclusive education improves academic and social outcomes for all students. Then teacher training, professional development helps teachers implement inclusive practices effectively. What are the challenges in inclusive education? There is a lack of resources. Many schools lack funding for assistive devices and infrastructure. Then teacher readiness is not up to the mark. Not all teachers are trained in inclusive methods. Then social stigma, prejudice and discrimination still exist in many communities. Then policy gaps. Inconsistent implementation of policies affects the progress. So how do you conclude? The evolution of inclusive education reflects society's growing commitment to equality. From segregation to integration and now to inclusion, the journey has been significant. Inclusive education is not about placing all children in the same classroom. It is about ensuring every child feels valued and supported. While challenges remain, the goal of inclusive education is achievable. It requires a collective effort from governments, educators and communities. By embracing diversity, we can create a better future for all learners. What was the earliest approach to educating children with disabilities? Let us examine some questions. What was the earliest approach to educating children with disabilities? That is special education. That came first. Special education was the first formal system developed to address the needs of children with disabilities, providing specialized instruction in segregated environments, separate environments, or in separate systems, school systems. Focus on special education, emphasizing potential, addressing limitation, promoting equality, encouraging social inclusion. So what was the main focus of special education? What is the right one? Addressing limitations. They were worried about the limitations of the children rather than giving them wholesome development. Addressing limitations, is the main focus of special education. Special education focused on tailoring teaching methods to the disabilities of students, often emphasizing their limitations. What was the major drawback of special education? Lack of trained teachers and lack of infrastructure, isolation of students from mainstream education, inadequate funding. So what was the major drawback of special education? That is isolation of students from mainstream education. Special education segregated children with disabilities from their peers, limiting social and academic integration. Which movement influenced the rise of integrated education? Which movement? Feminist movement, civil rights movement, industrial revolution, environmental movement. That is civil rights movement. The civil rights movement advocated for equality, influencing education systems to integrate children with disabilities into regular schools. What is a defining feature of integrated education? Students adapt to the regular system, schools provide assistive devices, teachers receive special training, all students receive individual attention. What is a defining feature of integrated education? Students adapt to the regular system. In integrated education, students with disabilities were placed in regular systems without significant adjustment to the system. What principle forms the foundation of inclusive education? What principle forms the foundation of inclusive education? Diversity is a problem. All children have equal value. Special needs are required. Separate schools. Academic achievement is a primary goal. Which is the right one? What principle forms the foundation of inclusive education? That is, all children have equal value. Inclusive education promotes the idea that every child is equally valuable regardless of abilities or background. What does inclusive education emphasize? Segregation, flexibility in teaching methods, uniform teaching approaches, standardized testing. Flexibility in teaching methods. Inclusive education focuses on adapting teaching methods to meet the diverse needs of all learners. What is the main goal of inclusive education? Providing quality education to all in separate classrooms, creating accessible infrastructure only for disabled students, ensuring all children learn together in the same classroom, encouraging students with disabilities to self-study. Among the four, by this time you would guess the correct answer. What is the main goal of inclusive education? That is to ensure all children learn together in the same classroom. No separation, no disparity. Everything is given to these children along with the normal children. Nothing is separate. So ensuring all children learn together in the same classroom. Inclusive education aims to integrate all students into the same learning environment with equal opportunities. Which concept best describes the shift to inclusive education? Which concept best describes the shift to inclusive education? Adaptation of students, transformation of the education system, segregation of diverse learners, focus on academic performance only. So, which is the right and which concept? Transformation of the education system. See, completely overall, education system is completely overall to include every other child in the normal classroom. So, the transformation of the education system. Inclusive education involves systematic changes to address the needs of all learners. What key international framework supports inclusive education? What key international framework supports inclusive education? Kyoto Protocol, United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Paris Agreement. That is United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This framework emphasizes the right of people with disabilities to inclusive education. So this is the key organization, United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. What is one benefit of inclusive education for all students? Improved empathy and cooperation, higher academic scores for gifted students, increased focus on individual achievement, faster paced curriculum, which is the right one. What is one benefit of inclusive education for all students? That is improved empathy and cooperation. People are empathetic towards integrated children or children with disabilities. Improved empathy and cooperation. Inclusive education fosters mutual understanding and teamwork among students. The normal children are able to see such children with a certain empathy, sympathy, and so they are able to cooperate with them in their studies. There is a true sense of love here. So that is called improved empathy and cooperation. What is the common barrier to inclusive education? Lack of legislative support, overqualified teachers, social stigma, excessive funding. So what is the common barrier to inclusive education? That is a social stigma. Negative attitudes and discrimination against disabilities hinder inclusive practices. What does education for all mean in the context of inclusive education? Education only for students with disabilities? Education for privileged students? Equal access and participation for every child? A focus on elite schools. So which is the right one? Education for all means equal access and participation for every child. Inclusive education ensures every child, regardless of abilities, is part of the learning process. What was the primary issue with the integrated education? What was the primary issue? Students with disabilities were placed in special schools, teachers were not trained for diverse needs, schools provided excessive support, students resisted adaptation. Which is the right one? What was the primary issue with the integrated education? That is, teachers were not trained for diverse needs, because unless the teachers are trained to cater to the needs of such children with disabilities, it is not possible for this system to be successful. So teachers were not trained for diverse needs is the correct answer. Integrated education lacked adequate teacher preparation and systematic adjustments. What role does teacher training play in inclusive education? What role does teacher training play in inclusive education? limits diversity in classrooms, improves teacher skills to address diverse needs, promotes the segregation of learners, focuses only on standardized instruction. That is, improves the teacher skills to address diverse needs. Teacher training ensures the educators are equipped to use inclusive strategies. Why is inclusive education considered beneficial to society? What is the reason? No, inclusive education is considered beneficial to society. It fosters understanding and acceptance. It reduces the need for legislation. It focuses only on high achieving students. It eliminates cultural diversity. It is actually it fosters understanding and acceptance. Inclusive education promotes a sense of community and respect for differences. They are not kept separate. No, they are with the normal children. That means there is a sense of community. Give and take in love. That's the understanding. Inclusive education promotes a sense of community and respect for differences. What is the key characteristic of schools in inclusive education? Segregation of learners, accessibility for all students, preference for standardized testing, elimination of diversity. What is the key characteristic of schools in inclusive education? There is accessibility for all students. Inclusive schools are designed to accommodate the needs of every learner. What was the primary aim of special schools in the 19th century? So that is nothing but specialized instruction. So it's separate, something separate. They were kept separate and they were given some specialized instruction, which is not given to the normal children. So that way they were kept separate, and there were differences between special children in special schools and normal children. So that was taken away now. That was removed. That type of stigma has been removed by inclusive education now. So what was the primary aim of special schools in the 19th century? Specialized instruction. These schools focused on tailored teaching for specific disabilities. What did integrated education fail to provide adequately? What did integrated education fail to provide adequately? That is, what is that? That is adjustment to curriculum and teaching. The system placed students in regular schools but did not sufficiently modify the teaching methods or environment. So it proved to be a failure for the children with disabilities, because the teaching methods and the environment were not conducive to the children with disabilities. So that is the idea here. What is this system? This system, integrated education, of course they were put together along with the normal children, but then the curriculum and teaching methods were not as different. The same old curriculum methods and teaching strategies were used, so which were not appreciated by the children with disabilities. So the system placed students in regular schools but did not sufficiently modify the teaching methods or environment. Which of the following is not a challenge in inclusive education? Policy gaps, social stigma, overabundance of resources, lack of trained teachers. Which of the following is not a challenge in inclusive education? That is, overabundance of resources. Resource constraints, not overabundance, are common challenge in inclusive education. Which approach views diversity as a strength? Special education, integrated education, inclusive education, traditional education. That is inclusive education. Inclusive education values and celebrates diversity. What was the key limitation of special education? Focus on potential rather than limitations, lack of professional teachers, segregation of students, emphasis on diversity. What was the key limitation of special education? That is segregation of students. Special education isolated students with disabilities from their peers. What does inclusive education aim to eliminate? Specialized instruction, individual differences, barriers to participation, teacher training. So what does inclusive education aim to eliminate? Nothing but barriers to participation. Inclusive education seeks to remove obstacles that prevent full participation by all learners. What is required for the success of inclusive education? What is required for the success of inclusive education? Limited collaboration, standardized instruction for all, effort from governments, educators and communities, exclusive focus on physical disabilities. What is required for the success of inclusive education? That is Effort from governments, educators and communities. Collaborative effort is essential to implement inclusive practices effectively. What key idea is central to the philosophy of inclusive education? Of course, by this time you would have known that among the four alternatives, which is the right one? Uniformity among students, valuing every child equally, reducing the diversity of classrooms, separating students based on ability. Of course, what is the key idea central to the philosophy of inclusive education? That is valuing every child equally. Inclusive education is founded on the belief in the equal worth and potential of all children. Thank you very much, dear friends. God bless you abundantly. Let us meet in other video lectures. I request you to, of course, give comments and subscribe, like, so that my value gets some value because of you. And you can give your suggestions also on what I could change. Everything you can tell me. God bless you abundantly.